Coming to you from the South Hills Mall in Poughkeepsie, New York, across the hall from the Kmart. Welcome to the Arcade Archives. We just opened for the day. Come on in.
So, a creature for my amusement. Prepare for battle.
You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Sewer and the Kodan Armada. Get ready? Prepare for blast off.
Hey! You moved my thumb! There's a Donkey Kong kill screen coming up if anybody wants to watch.
All right, Playin. Tell me, you got quarters?
So, if you're game, let's coin up.
Pull up a bar stool next to your favorite game. Here's your host, Ray.
Hey Arcaders, it's Ray the Arcade Guy. Here I am at the all-new Arcade Archives podcast. Welcome everyone. I'm very excited about this. Our first episode is going to delve into something that is very near and dear to me, has been since I was in my mid-teens. And with all the things going on at Atari, I thought it was really poignant or momentous or however you want to call it to start the very first podcast on the Arcade Archives with the soon-to-be released, Atari 400 Mini. I can't tell you how excited I am. Words cannot describe, emotions cannot describe. I grew up with an Atari computer. It shaped me into who I became, and was that one thing I had at that age, at that time in my life, where I could go, be by myself, and play some of the greatest games that I've ever played before or even since. That it's that iconic. And by judging other podcasters and vloggers and people on YouTube, they feel the same way, which is surprising because I really didn't think there was that big a fan base for Atari 8-bit computers, but boy was I wrong. It seemed like for the longest time it was always about the C64. I had a friend that had a C64. I wasn't impressed. I mean, it was okay, but I loved my Atari 8-bit computer. And the interesting thing is I started with an Atari 400, so this really brings back memories. The Atari 400 Mini is exactly like what I had, my first year of computing. Wade Rosen and everybody over at Atari, they've been knocking them out of the park lately. And, a lot of people are skeptical and stuff, but it's funny because I remember when the Atari 50th collection was announced, and I, got it for Christmas last year, I could tell the change in tone from Atari right from that release, because they were really putting fairly obscure things on that collection. Particularly, you had the Atari 8-bit, you had some 5200, you had some Jaguar, you had some Lynx. It was a nice little mix. Could have been better in some areas, but I would have added more Atari 8-bit. That's my opinion. But from that moment on, I knew Atari had something going on, and that was just the beginning, because then, of course, all the My Arcade stuff happened, and the mini handheld, and the Game Station Pro, which is amazing. You can add games to it, and the amazing thing about it is that My Arcade listened to what people were saying before it was released. Of course, they had the announcement last year at CES, and right away, people were saying, not sure about the controllers, we need a dial of some sort, whether it be a paddle controller or something on the stick they listened right away, made those alterations. Same thing with adding games. That became like a big focal point when it came out. Then, of course, you had the Atari 2600 Plus, which just, like, nailed it. Like, hit it right out of the park for a lot of people. Yes, it is a software-based emulation system, meaning it reads the ROM from the cartridge. And some, I've always said, my opinion on this whole thing has been, play the way you want to play, not what everybody says you should do, okay? If you're into emulation, I have some emulation, and, it's always for those things that either you can't find, you don't have the money to get that system, or, hey, you got to do what you got to do. And especially for people that maybe have the cartridges but lost the system, that happens quite often, or they're just looking to jump in and they want to buy the cartridges, and now they have a brand new system which they can play those cartridges that they purchased. I think it's a fantastic idea. Well, then you have the acquisitions. You have the acquisition of Stern, which to me was huge. They, a lot of people, and myself included, think that was because of Berserk, which was a huge title. People don't realize how big a title that was for Atari when it came out. I had it in my hands the day it was released because I loved Berserk so much in the arcade. I wanted that experience at home. And to have it on the 2600 of all things, and it played so well. And then of course there was the 5200 that had the enhanced voice and everything. But that 2600 version really, I think, hit a sweet spot for a lot of people. And now that they have the rights to that, of course, you had the 2600 Plus, and you could buy Berserk Voice Enhanced, which is phenomenal if you haven't played it. But there's so many titles within the Stern canon, that the arcade titles, some of which have never been released. I am excited to see what happens there. And then they acquired Digital Eclipse, because, here's Digital Eclipse. They've been around for 30 plus years, give or take, and, really started the emulation scene as we know it today. They're the reason we have emulation, in my opinion. You can take it or leave it. They started the whole thing. I remember getting the Williams collection on the PlayStation, and there was an interview with one of the programmers. They said the guys from Digital Eclipse came in with a computer, and they started playing Defender right out of the gate, and they're like, wow, that is very accurate. And he said, that's your ROM playing on that. And that was like the discovery of fire. I mean, you're talking early, mid-90s, in that time frame, 92, 93, probably 94, somewhere in there. That blew everybody's mind. And then a few years later, of course, we had MAME, and everything kind of took off from there. Well, now Atari's acquired Digital Eclipse, who did the Atari 50th collection for them. And then on top of it all, they acquire Atari Age. And a lot of people are upset about that. I'm not. Albert has been running that site for at least 20 years. And now I could be off on the date, but I think it's fairly close. Knowing that Albert now has financial backing, and I guess he's going to stay on as the administrator. I really hope he does, because it's his vision that Atari Age became what it was. And then everybody saw it, joined in on the fun, and really made it what it became. So Atari owning that is huge, okay? Everybody's kind of waiting to see what the next move is. M Network got acquired, which is a very small, select few games that Intellivision released on the Atari 2600. Not sure what they're going to do with that yet. There really hasn't been any word on it, but then all of a sudden, CES happens just a few weeks ago, and they announced Atari 400 Mini. And it's like, this is what I've wanted. Like, I have always bought one mini machine since all these minis came out, because I really didn't have an interest. Everything that I can usually play, I can do via emulation if I don't have it myself, and I have a lot of systems. But the one system I didn't have at the time, and I kicked myself because I had two of them, was a TurboGrafx 16. So when that was announced, of course, I had to have it. So I bought that. Great system. We might do a whole thing on that, and if you go back to last year, this time, I started doing TurboGrafx 16 memories, and I'm going to continue doing that at a later date and keep going through the titles that I played, because that's a great system. But back on track, now we have the 400 Mini. and it's playing Atari 8-bit software. It is playing all of Atari 8-bit software. So all the Atari 8-bit computers plus the 5200 are going to be available for you to play either what's on the system, which I think was 25 games, but I could be wrong. I'll have to look it up, as well as being able to plug in a USB dongle with your software and play it straight from the dongle. That's incredible. You could add a flash drive. You could do, a outside hard drive. However you want to do it. You could set that thing up, and it will play, hopefully everything that you remember from the Atari 8-bit line software. That's all I've ever wanted. In my opinion, there's been a few emulators for the 8-bit line. They can be difficult to navigate because they too allow you to emulate all the 800 or the Atari 8-bit computer line, but you have to be able to load individually through each tier. And it can become complicated. It's fun, but to know that they're coming out with a dedicated unit, you plug and play, hook it up, ready to go. I went to go pre-order and they're already sold out. So that tells you right there that this was something that everybody wanted right out of the gate. So I'm very excited. Atari's going some fantastic directions, and I'm all for it. And I know a lot of you are too. So today I thought we would go over my history with the Atari 8-bit computer, which I've spoken about here and there, but I thought it would be really good to really delve deep and go over the timeline of what I had, what I played. It was a really amazing time. Like I said before, when a day was rough and I didn't want to, contribute to society as a mid-teenager, 15, 16 years old, I went into my computer lab, which was my dad's old den, and we'll get into that later. And I would turn that computer on and put in something and just start playing. And it was, in my opinion, because I didn't get a ColecoVision until later on, and as I got older, it was the closest I could get to the arcade. Everything that I played on it was spot on, and I was really excited about it. And I want you guys to be excited about it too. So I thought I would tell my story of how I got involved in the Atari 8-bit line of computers. Are you ready for this? Come on, let's go get this whole conversation started.
The Arcade Archives.
1982 was a very pivotal year in my life. That's when I got my very first computer. But it started at really the beginning of the year. No, actually, we're going to go back even farther than that. I would say September, October 1981. That's when we got the Apple IIs in our high school. Now, computers in schools are like second nature now, but back in those days, there were no computers in school. You had your library, you had microfilm, you had microfiche, you had other forms of media within the library, magazines and tapes and records and other stuff that you could do to gather information. But that year we came back to school to find that part of the AV lab in the back of the library had been turned into a little computer area. There were 2 or 3 Apple IIs back there. Plus, there was a mathematics lab, or a classroom, if you will, had been turned into a computer lab. And in there was probably 15 Apple IIs all hooked up. And then we had a computer class finally. But what was interesting was the teachers were learning the classes as well. They would learn them the week before they would teach them, or even 2 weeks before they would teach that class. And then they'd give you assignments, and you'd only be able to work on them in the school because, of course, nobody had a computer at home. And we were all using Apple Basic, and would have to create a program that we were given, and we would have to write line for line code in Basic and then submit it to the teacher. And I was one of the ones that would always look at code and say, how can I do something else with it? And I make take a piece of code here or there in my notes and create something else. And I just did it on my own spare time in the AV lab because I was an AV person, of course. And I would have so much fun in just looking at the code. You know, back then it was interesting because, you know, again, you're going, you know, and you do it today, you know, Python script and other things that we use, but to go line by line by line and create something, and then say, for example, you've entered something wrong, and then you have to go back and look for that mistake. I always like to look at it as like plumbing or electrical work in a house. You know, there's always the source of that problem. Your job is to find that problem and fix it. And the same thing can be said about coding. And that's why I loved it so much. Like, I could do it all the time. Well, you know, by summer of '82, I really, really wanted a computer. So I had gone to like Radio Shack and looked at the Tandys and the Cocos, and then I would, my primary resource of actually getting information for computers at the time was Electronic Games Magazine, because at this point, you know, the home computer market had opened up enough that they were doing full-page ads for computers like the VIC-20. You would look at it and, you know, give you some of the information, and primarily on that end of it, though, was about the games. And that fascinated me even more because I was a gaming guy, so it was like, wow, look at all this stuff you can play on these computers. So I was weighing in on like different computers and what I really, really wanted out of the computer. The one computer they didn't speak a lot about other than in articles, but sometimes you get full-page ads for games that came on it, were the Atari 8-bit line. Now, the Atari 8-bit line had been around a bit at this point. It had been introduced in 1979 and was probably one of the more higher end, probably a good way to put it. I think the VIC-20 was a little bit lower in price because that was what Commodore did to pull people in. They would lower the price of their product, you know. And of course you had the Sinclairs. They popped out of nowhere. I remember the Timex Sinclair commercial and looking at this little bitty box that had the weird keyboard, and I was like, you know, I could work with that. I could get one of those, and those were really cheap. That was like incredible low end. Like, I think you could get in at a base point of like $99 on the Sinclair computers, and they were being released here in the States by Timex, of all things. It was very weird. But, you know, so I'm looking at all these computers, but the one that really kept coming back to me was the Atari 8-bit line. I loved the code was very similar. I think all of them were probably pretty similar with, you know, some exceptions in code, but the 8-bit line really just spoke to me. And it was October of 1982 when, you know, I had been telling my mom, hey, I want a computer for Christmas. That's what I want this year. I don't want anything else, just want a computer. So we went to a store. I want to say I think this was the place. It was right across the street from South Hills Mall in Poughkeepsie on Route 9. And it was called Computerland. And I remember going in there, and it was the first computer store I had really been in. Like, there were other stores like Video Connection down in Dutchess Mall, but that was more televisions and sound systems and, you know, video game consoles and things like that. But this was the first true, legit computer store I had been in. They had Apples everywhere. They had, you know, the Commodore line. They had a bunch of different brands of computer. But the one that got me was that Atari, and they had a giant display and the Atari 8-bit line side by side. You had the 400, the 800, and, you know, of course, you know, back then they would have these displays just like they do at like GameStop, where, you know, they had the giant display and you could play it and kick the tires and really see what the computer could do. So I was, you know, trying them all out, and I got to the Atari, and it just was like, you know, a perfect fit. I really, really liked what it could do. And, you know, I tried both of them, and, you know, everybody complains about the membrane keyboard, but to me it wasn't terrible. It was different than the 800's real keyboard, of course, but it wasn't terrible. You know, my mom said, okay, have you whittled it down to what you want? And I said, you know, Mom, I'm going to stick with the Atari line. And she knew Atari because we had a 2600 for a couple years at that point. So for her, it was like, okay, this is a brand I know. And I think that's why a lot of people had them was because, they grew up on Atari for a few years. I mean, you had your Pong machines and things like that. Then you had the 2600 series, especially if you came into it in 77, and then, 79, they come out with the 8-bit line. So, it was a name that people back then trusted, because it was right there. And I'm from Poughkeepsie. It's like IBM Central. So, to say that speaks volumes, because, at that point, IBM PCs were not cheap, and the personal computer line really didn't hit its stride until like another year later, when the PC Junior really, came into its own. But you had to have big bucks in order to get one of those. But the Atari 8-bit line was not cheap. I remember the 800 was like, I want to say close to $1,000, if not $1,000. Of course, we didn't get the high end. We got the 400, which was fine by me. I was good with it. So we purchased that and a handful of games, and my mom says, now we're driving home, and she says, I'm going to let you use it for one night. You can hook it to the TV, have fun with it, and then when you're done, I want it back in the box, and you don't see it until Christmas. So I take it out of the box. I put the BASIC was not built in at first. You had the BASIC cartridge that came with the computer. So then you pop the BASIC cartridge in and you start going at it. And I'm doing 20 lines of code here, and and creating some graphic things, and it was just, I was in love. It was amazing that I was able to do this in my house, and we got the little 410 cassette drive for it, so I was able to save data on it. And it was incredibly slow, but you got to remember, this was like my very first computer, so for me this was like the end-all be-all. It was not like today where you have a hard drive built into your computer and nobody thinks about it anymore. This was it. I mean, you had your computer and you had your data storage, and that was it. So I do a little code. I think I had it out for about 4 or 5 hours, because as soon as I got home, I plugged that bad boy in downstairs on the television in our family room in the basement, and I'm going at it. I'd say it was around 12 o'clock when I put it away, and I had tried out the games, and they were phenomenal. And that thing got boxed up and put wherever my mom put gifts, and it stayed there until Christmas. And then eventually, Christmas comes, and before that, though, even earlier than that. So after we had bought the computer, my mom decides, hey, let's convert your father's den into a workstation for your computer. Now, this was a really big deal, because my dad had passed in 1980, and as I recall, a lot of things were left right where they were before he passed. And the den was like a big one, because the den my dad built himself. We had bought our house in 1977, and it was a 2-bay garage. So one bay, if you were looking at the front of the house, or the side of the house where the garage was, but you were out front, the left side door, that garage was turned into a playroom, and it had a bathroom you could use to change into your bathing suit for the pool, and a pool table. And then the right side, he kept half of it as workbench and his tools and everything else, and then the inside part, he cut out a section for a door, and that got turned into his den, and he had put in inlay bookcases across one wall, and there's a little TV and a chair kind of in the middle of the room, and that was where my dad went to kind of decompress, especially as he started to get sicker. He would love to be in that room and be surrounded by all his books and literature that he had growing up, and he had a little desk, and that room was kind of you didn't go in. It was very disrespectful, unless you had to grab a book for research or whatever for your homework, because we had encyclopedias and everything else in there. But you left that room alone. Well, then all of a sudden my mom turns to me one day. It was right after we'd gotten the computer, and she's like, let's turn the den into your workstation. And we cleared off the back wall, because if you came into the room, the right side, that's where he had all his inlaid bookshelves. And then the back wall, I don't remember really what was on the back wall. It might have been the desk or something. We kind of cleared out that area, and we put in basically what looked like a workbench. And we built it out of plywood and 2x4s, and made the whole length of that room it butted right up to the wall, because there was a corner, and then around the corner started the bookshelf. So it kind of butted up there, but didn't cover the bookshelves because it wasn't wide enough to cover those bookshelves. And I had a couple bar stools in there, and I was super excited because it was like this was my place to sit down and work and play on my computer. And then the computer, of course, Christmas, and immediately I go downstairs, and I had a little 13-inch color television that we had gotten for it, and hooked it all up, and I was in heaven. The only way to describe it, it was just like, this was it. I mean, I was like, I had a personal computer of my own, and I would go down it for hours at a time, because I was in computer class. Now, again, some of the parameters were different between Apple Basic and Atari Basic, but they were pretty much the same. There was little variables that had to change, and words would change. Lines kind of were different as far as the code and the different words you had to use in that code. So, but the basic foundation was exactly the same. So I could take those programs, alter them a little bit, and put them on my Atari computer so I could continue learning while I was at home. And that's what I told my mom, because she was like, yeah, sure, you're just going to play games. And I'm like, no, Mom, I'm into this computer programming thing, and I'm really digging it. This is really cool. So, now I had the ability to do it at home. That didn't mean I didn't play games. I remember getting it, and with the computer I had gotten Centipede and Pac-Man. And I had written about Pac-Man in one of the articles. You can find it on the site. I believe it was for the Atari 50th anniversary, and I had written about the Atari. It was 1982 40 year for Pac-Man, and how I had gotten the Atari 2600 version, and I didn't hate it. I thought it, did its job and gave you that kind of taste of Pac-Man without it really looking like it. And then, of course, at the very end, I said, well, that all bets were off as soon as I got my Atari 8-bit, because then I had the 8-bit version of Pac-Man. I will tell you, to this day, it's still one of my favorite ports of Pac-Man. Even though we've advanced so far, we can play the actual ROM on, any computer. But, besides that, the NES had a decent port, and that was done by Namco and all of those. But then I still kept going back to the Atari 8-bit Pac-Man. There was just something about it I loved. First off, the ghosts were really cool because they didn't have, the typical, whites and irises like in the arcade. They just had little tiny slits for eyes, but those two little eyes would move just like the ones in the arcade. And, those little attentions to detail really are what make a decent port of an arcade game. And it was just knowing that the movement with the eyes were following it. To me, that's what stood out. But the gameplay was virtually the same. You'd hit that second apple and you'd get a little faster. You would hit the second pear and you'd get a little faster. Those were little sweet touches to detail that were really, really cool. And the fact that you could select what fruit you wanted to start on, right up to key, which was in itself amazing. And even the energizers would match the ones in the arcade. So when you got up to key, you would get like where you'd eat it and they would change direction. It was exactly the same. And then of course you'd have those gimme levels where, for one level everything was set a bit slower so you could, get points and feel more confident, and wham, they'd hit you with the next level where everything was moving so fast that you knew you were going to get caught. You just knew it. It worked exactly the same, and it was a phenomenal port. And like I said, to this day, it's still one of my favorites. Centipede also was really just a great version of Centipede. I sat and played those for hours and hours and hours, and I don't think I got another physical cartridge until that summer of '83 when Donkey Kong came out. And the thing was, it was out of the blue. I went into Computerland. I usually went up there at least once a week to, see some of the homebrews, because homebrews were different back then. Somebody would program a game and they put it in make copies of it, put it in a Ziploc bag, a little instruction sheet, and a little label, and staple it together, and that might sell for $10 or $5, somewhere around there. And I had a few of those too. Most of those were all of them were on cassette at that time. So load times, your mileage may vary. It could take up to 20 minutes for the game to load. That was like one of my favorites from Datasoft was Canyon Climber. And that was before Donkey Kong came out, so it was very similar in approach to Donkey Kong, but it was like you were in the Grand Canyon, and you had to climb up to the top, and then you had to take out a bridge because you could hit these TNT things on the bridges and they would blow up. And I loved that game, but it took like 15 minutes for it to load, so it was like you played that game as much as you could, because you knew if you turned it off, you had to reload that game and start the process all over. And that was frustrating. But then I walked into Computerland, and there it was. They had the official Atari 8-bit version of Donkey Kong sitting there, and it looked great, for what it was. Of course, you had the ColecoVision out at that point, and their version was spot on practically. But what made this one unique is it was the only one that had the Pie Factory level. I think it might have been the first home version that actually had the Pie Factory level included in the game from the get-go, because all of them, including the ColecoVision, did not fit that level on. And it was frustrating, because that was one of the most fun levels. But it's incredibly short, and that's probably why they said, we don't need that one. We got the elevators; those are cool. Everybody looks at the elevators and loves that. But the 8-bit Atari version was the first one to come out with that level. And funny story, there is an article, I may link it for this podcast on the website, but there was an article about the programmer of that game, and supposedly hated Donkey Kong. Actually, just absolutely hated the game. He played it, and he was like, I don't like it. But he, of course, programs the best version that you could get back then. And even today, again, like Pac-Man, it holds up. It's a great version of Donkey Kong, and I loved it. We skip ahead a little bit. I want to say it was, actually we're going to go back because we were just talking about Donkey Kong, but we're going to go, I think it was like February, March of 1983. We had it was a Career Path Expo, or so I think that's what it was called. And basically, it was almost like a science fair. You would bring in like materials of things you wanted to do in your career outside of high school. And, whatever it may be. You bring in, if you were going to be a construction worker, you had a hard hat or whatever. I had my computer, so I was like, I want to, because my plan back then was, hey, maybe IBM will hire me on, because, when you hit 11th grade back then, they would have these career fairs, and you would go, and, we had two IBM plants. Well, we only had one at the time. The second one was built in 84. So we had the big plant to the left of us. You're looking at the front of the school, and that was a giant plant. And I had walked it during our career fair and everything else. I really wanted to work for IBM. I thought that was a great company at the time. And, I've known people who've worked for IBM, and they're still there in Poughkeepsie. I really wanted to show during this little career fair that we were having at school in the library, hey, I brought in my computer, showed off some of the stuff I had done, this was like the discovery of fire, and, how everything loaded and this and that. And then I met a guy named Alex, who was in school with me, and he came up to my little table and he says, you got an Atari 400? I'm like, yeah, this is great, isn't it? He says, yeah, but I got an 800. I'm like, oh God. I said, it's funny, I at that point, because it was only 16K in the machine, and I'm like, I wanted to be able to expand eventually. And I said, yeah, I think, maybe next year I'll save up and get a Atari 800 computer where I could get it up to 48K at the time, I believe it was, or 64. And it was like, yeah, I'm going to save up. And he says, well, a couple days later we're talking at lunch, and he's like, I've got a proposition for you. He says, yeah, I'm thinking about getting the new Atari 1200 XL when it comes out. The 1200 was kind of a failed attempt at upgrading the 8-bit line at the time. And he wanted one because it hadn't come out yet. And he says, I'll tell you what, I will sell you my 800 for your 400, and I think it was like a couple $100. Didn't realize his family was very rich. So I was like, okay, let's think about this. And I talked to my mom about it, and she's like, you sure you want to do this? You just got the computer. And I said, well, Mom, it has a lot of upgrades that my computer doesn't have. She's okay, that's fine. Well, it also came with, I think he had 2 disk drives with it. And so I was like, yeah, you know what, let's do this. I think it was like $200, my computer. I'm like, okay. So, I get the 800, and now I've got the disk drives, and I'm off to the races. And of course, he has bootleg copies of games on disc. And I find out later, he has this little, we go against the grain on the piracy thing, but, the writing was on the wall back then that things were not good at Atari, and I think everybody can agree or disagree at this point that piracy saved a lot of games that probably would have never seen the light of day, from Atari particularly, because as the Tramiels came in and people were being let go left and right, they would have gotten rid of that code, and we would just be talking about some of the games that we a lot of us were able to save back then. But yeah, I had just this massive disc collection of all these games. So now I'm introduced into games I hadn't even touched, because back then, like I said in the beginning, it was just about hand coding programs and running them, and that really did it for me. But now I had not only that, but I had this giant collection of games, and I'm going through and I'm playing Synapse games and Datamost games, and the list could go on and on and on. And it was just such an amazing time because I could go in that room, shut the door, and it was like my own personal arcade at any time at this point, because now I had all this software. I loved that computer, and to this day I still have it. It's in the garage right now. I don't have it unpacked, with the 2 disk drives and my big sleeve of games, which probably now have bit rot. Yeah, so that is my history with the Atari 8-bit line of computers, and that probably lines up pretty well with just about anybody my age at that time and how they got introduced to their first computer. It was, to describe it to kids today, there is no description. It's kind of like, we didn't have any of this. It's like when video games first came home, we didn't have any of it. There was no definition. There was no parameters to say what was good or what was bad or whatever back then. It was, here you are, and, the lines were drawn as time went on. But the Atari 8-bit will always have a special place in my heart as the machine that really got me started on my path to everything I've done on a PC at this point. It's an incredible machine. If you have a chance to get one, I highly recommend it. If you're an enthusiast in older gaming computers, it's a great machine to have. And now that the new one's coming out, it's like I didn't realize how many people really enjoyed this machine until now. So it's amazing, and it just makes my heart happy to talk about the Atari 8-bit line of computers. Well, that's the history I have with the Atari 8-bit line of computers, and I will tell you what memories that thing brings back. I think that's for anybody that's ever had their first computer. But there's something special about having a first computer back in the early 80s, a computer that was built in 1979. Now, of course, the hardware would go on to be used in the 5200 as well, and that's something we will discuss when we go over the specs of this fantastic machine that's about to come out. But the thing that I'm really, really excited about is, for years, it's always been about the Commodore 64. I understand there's a huge fan base out there for the Commodore series of computers, but never much love or any spotlight shown on the Atari 8-bit line. And now we finally are seeing it. And what amazes me is all the people that are coming out of the woodwork now saying, oh man, I grew up with that computer. You know, finally we're seeing it. And I love that. I'm embracing it now, because I'm going back now and watching videos of games I played almost 40 years ago in some cases, or just about at 40 years ago. And those games still stun me. Like, they were addictive and fun to play and so colorful and just vibrant sound, and it wasn't a better time to grow up with a computer than in the early 80s. I am going to say that right now. I know that a lot of people out there grew up in the late 80s, early 90s, and they had their PC clones and everything else. To sit there on an 8-bit computer and do the things we did, and it was the very beginning of it. It was the nexus of everything that came afterward. That's what the Atari 8-bit line means to me. And the fact that I still have my 800, my original 800, it's packed away, unfortunately. I don't have it out right now because I don't have a CRT. And I really don't want to mod the machine, which I thought about doing for a little bit until the announcement of this little machine came up. That's why I haven't modified it. And eventually I'll get a CRT television and hook it up and play it. Yeah, I could hook it up to my flat screen. It's going to be all washed out. And you just miss the look of that CRT glow and you know, real scan lines. And there's just nothing that can duplicate that in a way that is fused into your memory like it is with me and a lot of people my age. So eventually it'll get hooked up again. But anyway, let's get to the reason that I've done this podcast, and that's to talk about the Atari 400 Mini. This machine came out of the blue. One day there was nothing, and the next day it was a big announcement and coming out in March. And you know, pre-orders are up right now on Amazon and anywhere else probably that you can purchase this thing. I thought I'd pull up Amazon and let's go over some of the description and some of the details that they have up there. And I'm also going to try to look up the specs of this machine and see what we can find out about it. Now, some of the features and details that are described on Amazon's website are that it will emulate all Atari 8-bit systems. This is really important. From the 400 through the 800 XL and the Atari 5200 home console. That is massive, because when you're emulating, there is an emulator that allows you to play all of them, but you have to swap between what system you are working with. You actually have to click and say, I'm going to be on the 5200 platform. How much memory do we have? All those things. You will not have to do that with this machine, hopefully. Crossing our fingers, this should be plug and play. Okay? Now, it will be multi-region, 720 HD output via HDMI with the 50 Hz PAL and a 60 Hz NTSC compatibility. So either side of the ocean, you're going to be able to experience everything you did when you were a child. Now, I understand that over in Europe there was a bigger market for the Commodore 64. So it'd be very interesting to hear from people over there who did have an Atari computer and what their experiences were. And I'd love to hear it. You know, shoot me an email through the Arcade Archives email page and leave a comment, because I'd love to hear from you and what you guys experienced using your computer, either when it first came out, in the 80s, in the 90s, if you happen to get it used, however you did. I'd love to hear what your opinions are about this machine. Now, you'll also be able to play in a 4x3 original or at pixel perfect aspect ratio, like a lot of machines. Like if you go on the Switch, you'll be able to switch between a 4x3 screen, or you're going to go pixel perfect and it'll scrunch down a little bit. So you'll be able to do that, and you can play with or without CRT filter, so it's going to have a scanline generator, things like that. Which, in all honesty, that's a great feature. A lot of people have mixed feelings about filters. When I started working with the Raspberry Pi, and I have 2 machines in my arcade right now that run on a Pi, I love the idea that I could, not only do a CRT filter as far as scan lines, but I could do a barrel shape so that it mimics the round edges of the screen. Now, it's not three-dimensional, so it's going to be rounded in a two-dimensional sense, but it still gives you that, and it's very subtle. It's not like, like it's over the top, super curved, looks stupid. It looks well done, especially when I'm playing my arcade games. It looks fantastic. So it's nice to know that they're giving you those options if you want to use them. You don't have to. You could leave it alone and play it at its 4x3 and have a great time, or you can try all these features out and see which one appeals to you. That's the best part about having these filters, in my opinion. There are going to be 12 frames that you can use around them. Here's the thing: I'm not a fan of frames. I find that it's basically putting a monitor in a monitor, if you will. So you're playing on the main screen that you have in front of you. Now I have a secondary screen because it has a frame around it. So I usually turn those off. If you love them, they're there. They're going to have 12 of them. So you're going to be able to pick through a dozen, frames and see what you like. You are going to be able to rewind the gameplay up to 40 seconds, so that's great. So, like, if you're playing a game and you died, you could, like any other game, you can send it back and you'll be able to, kind of kick back sort of before you got killed, so you'll be great. Now, this one is the most important, and I think everybody is super excited about this feature. And that is you're going to be able to play your own games on your USB flash drive with a disc, cartridge, or cassette ROMs. So whatever you have from your computer will pop into this bad boy and you'll be able to play it. So that means this thing is wide open as far as being able to add games, which has always been a big sticking point with people in the last couple of years with various emulator boards, any kind of home system, any kind of arcade system. Like if you're into Pandora's Box, one of the features that has come up in the last 2 years is that you're able to add your own ROMs. That's a pretty great function because it's running off a base emulator, usually one. It could be a couple that it could flip back and forth between. So being able to add ROMs and being able to experience more games than what they gave you for your money, well spent. So knowing you'll be able to do that is fantastic. And the My Arcade Game Player, the Atari Game Player, allows you to do that as well, which is phenomenal. That they said, you know what, we're going to give you these games, but if you have these ROMs, however you got them, doesn't matter. You'll be able to plug them in, and away you go. And knowing that, especially with a machine like this, that has, a very weird market because, so many people experience the Atari 800 computer or the 8-bit line of computers. So knowing that that base could be relatively small, you're not going to see people running out and grabbing it unless they really had it or if it's something that they remember. But being able to say, okay, well, guess what? You can add more to it, that gives them value. And they're going to run out, get it. So, kudos to Atari for allowing them to do that. I think it's phenomenal. That's why I'm going to purchase one, because it's not only going to be the games that are on it, but I can add as many as I want. You'll be able to hook it up and away you go. It would be really cool if you could just take like an external hard drive like I have on my computer. I have 2 terabytes of hard drive sitting here, and you could just plug one of those in and have all your ROMs right there accessible, ready to go. Just the ROMs, nothing else on the hard drive. And you can go through the menu and play, because there's so many games. I mean, I don't have an accurate number at the moment, but I'll look it up. There's a lot of games that can be played on the Atari 8-bit line of computers, and all of them, were, there was probably exceptions to the rule, but everything that I played, I loved. Like, I would spend, like I said, in my memories, hours and hours and hours and hours on that machine. Like, it was my escape from not being able to get to the arcade, play games I wanted to play, or work that day, or whatever. If I was sitting at home, I was in there playing games. I was in there, learning how to program the machine. It was just, an amazing thing. So be able to have that, to just play games at the moment, That's fantastic. But being USB, you should be able to plug in a USB keyboard, and you'll be able to, use Atari Basic to program your own, not games, but simple programs like we used to. So that to me is fantastic as well. So that's a lot of what the features that you'll be able to have with it. So here's the list: 25 games that are going to be included with the Atari 400 Mini. Airball, Asteroids, Basketball, Battlezone, Berserk, which is interesting because they just bought all the Stern games, so that's really great that that's included. And it's a great port, I'm going to tell you right now. Boulder Dash, Bristles. Now, Boulder Dash and Bristles, two games that I really loved. Boulder Dash I had bought about a year and a half after I got my system, and a lot of fun. And most people play Boulder Dash, so if you played it, you know what you're in for. And this is the original version, so that's really cool. And Bristles is really cool because you run around, you're painting walls, and the graphics are really cool. You're a little painter, and you're in a house. Great game. Capture the Flag, Centipede, probably one of the best versions you can play at home. Crystal Castles, an Electric Glide, that's one of the ones I haven't played before. Encounter, Flip and Flop, Henry's House, Hover, Vover, Bruce Lee, the Datasoft platformer that is fantastic. You have a sumo wrestler and a ninja chasing you over these levels. You have to collect the lamps. If you've never played it, it is a very, very early platformer and is fantastic and highly recommended. Mule, Missile Command, O'Reilly's Mine, Star Raiders 2, Seven Cities of Gold, Wavy Navy, and Yomp, which is basically included in everything nowadays. It's on the Atari 50th collection, and it's like the Amiga bouncing ball, but you have to go through a rotating maze. It's a lot of fun. Also, I want to bring up Star Raiders 2 for a second. Star Raiders 2 had a different name. Star Raiders 2 was actually going to be The Last Starfighter. And I know because I had the original copy before it was changed to Star Raiders 2. And it actually had the Last Starfighter ship flying up in the air. Great game. A lot of fun. I love the scrolling effects of the planet underneath, and very challenging, a lot of fun. Every one of these games that I've played, I can tell you, is guaranteed hours and hours and hours of fun. So you're getting 25 games. It doesn't seem like a lot, but knowing that A, they're really good games, and B, you're able to add your own is worth its weight in gold. Now, one of the things also I wanted to talk about was the joystick. Now, this is not a functioning keyboard on the Atari 400 Mini. It is static. It's there for appearance. Well, they also have a specialty stick that is going to come with this thing that is basically going to be your keyboard. It's a specialty stick for this machine. It is designed to get through the menu system. I'm assuming to type. That would be really weird, but from what I understand, the joystick will look like the original Atari joystick, but where the little arrow icons are in the circle around the stick are going to be 4 buttons. They're hidden. You gotta, you'll be able to see them once you have it in your hand. And you push them, and then there's a couple buttons on the back end of it, and a thumbstick. So it's going to basically navigate you through the GUI. It will probably allow you some functionality as far as typing, but knowing that you can hook a USB to a keyboard to it, no problem. You're going to be able to type away in Atari Basic. I'm assuming it'll load into Atari Basic. Probably be able to turn it on and hold a button or something, and it'll take you into Basic. That's what I've been told. That it will have Basic included, so you'll be able to type your own programs on it. But the joystick is really the key to the system because it has multiple buttons to allow you to not only navigate through the GUI, but play certain games that may require more than one button. There's not many of those, but if you do have a game that requires more than one fire button, you'll have that at your disposal. But it's also USB compatible with any joystick you hook up. So if you have a USB joystick and it has multiple buttons, you'll be able to hook that up as well. Fully USB compatible with just about anything. That's what I've been told. This machine is, you can tell right away that Atari, this is a labor of love. because when the Atari line of computers came out, they saw the horizon. They saw companies like Apple and IBM fighting for, this piece of the PC pie in the early 80s. You had Commodore that was doing it as well. And Atari was a gaming company. They had nothing to do with computers at that time. So for them to release a computer, even back then, people were skeptical. Because again, they were a gaming company. They were known for Pong. They were known for the 2600, or the VCS as it was called then. That's what they were known for. So I think that was the biggest obstacle they had at the time, was the fact that they were a gaming company. Few people knew that this computer was a powerhouse of its time. It could do a lot with what it had. Even the 400 was capable of so many things. And it was a great stepping stone and a great learning tool. And that's what my 400 was to me. And then I got the 800, and I was able to do more. So as time went on, that's where my knowledge base grew and grew and grew, was because of the Atari computers. And to see that they're actually doing this for, the true Atari people that grew up with everything Atari. And it was kind of like the Nintendo syndrome of the early 80s. Video games were not, just called video games. They, parents called it Atari. Everything was Atari. So if you went to your mom and dad, who their generation knew nothing about video games, we were the first generation that did. And you went to them and said, hey, I want a computer, they're going to scratch their head and go, what? But if you said, hey, Atari has a new product, they're going to go, oh, Atari, yes, let's do that. Boom. That's what sold my mom on getting an Atari computer, was the fact that it had that name, it had that presence. Later on, Nintendo would go the same way. All you had to say was Nintendo. That defined video games for a lot of people. And Atari did the very same thing, only before they did. I can't wait to get my hands on this machine and actually play it and experience it. And maybe it'll be my first unboxing video that I really will post and will, put a lot of effort into, because I'm not, that I don't do that normally, but I really, really love the Atari line of computers. It was what I grew up with. It was part of my past. It was part of my history. And to see the love that has come out in the last month, that just out of the woodwork, people say, oh my, I had an Atari. Oh my gosh, I had the 400, or I had the 800, or I had the next generation of that. Everybody loved the Atari computer. And I'm so happy and so proud to be a part of that history. I hope you guys run out and pick one of these up. If you didn't have that experience, just for the nostalgia alone, being able to play the games that a lot of us grew up on, will blow your mind. It is probably the best machine that I ever played as a teenager, young kid, whatever, coming up. As much as I loved my NES, and I did, as soon as it came out I bought one, that Atari computer was always a part of me and what I wanted to do with my life and the things I wanted to learn. And everybody's had that experience with their computer. Whatever computer you were with, you had that experience. But very few had that experience with Atari computer. So I hope that you give this thing a chance. And watch the unboxing videos that come out very, very soon, because it's going to be a few weeks. And, a lot of the bigger guys are going to have their hands on it, and they're going to be able to, do their videos, and it'll be time to put them out, and you're going to be able to see what we experience. And I really am very excited about this, if you couldn't tell. So I'm going to leave it there. I think this was a great first Arcade Archive podcast. I am very, very, very excited to do this series for the Arcade Archives. I'm going to try to do anything video game related. I think my next one will probably be something to do with Nintendo. Something to do with Nintendo and, say, the theme park industry. I'm going to leave it right there. I'm not going to bring up anything else. You're going to have to find out on the next episode of the Arcade Archives podcast. We are shutting this one down and we're putting it in the can. Thank you very, very much for listening. I'll see you on the next one, and keep playing like it's 1981. Bye now. Well, arcaders, it looks like it's that time. It's about 9 o'clock. Time to shut the arcade down for tonight. It's not a weekend, so there's no late night showing at the movie theater. Security's going to start heading around here pretty soon, making sure all these gates are closed. So if I can have everybody grab their personal belongings, head to the exit. Thank you very much for stopping by and listening to my stories. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys have a great evening. Thanks for stopping by the Arcade Archives. And whatever podcast feed you're listening to us on, please be sure to subscribe and hit like. Same for YouTube. If you're over on YouTube, smash that bell so that you guys will know when our next podcast is out. Once again, thank you very much for stopping by. Let's get this place cleared out, Eugene. Can you get McDorfus off that machine, please?
Excuse me, young man. You've got to stop playing the games. You're a disgrace. Excuse me. Sir, would you stop playing the games? Young man, you must listen to me. Hey! Hey! I'm sorry, but you're not allowed to have food on the games.
No one's ever gotten 7 figures on this machine before. Not even me. I know this machine's capable of 7 figures.